My guest today is 5-time Grammy-nominated pianist, composer, arranger, and an Emmy-nominated music director and producer, John Beasley. He has performed, recorded with illustrious artists including Miles Davis, Freddie Hubbard, Hubert Laws, Diane Reeves, Jeff Tain Watts, Wallace Roney, James Moody, Christian McBride, Kenny Garrett, and Kenny Rankin, among others. He took the lead as music director for Steely Dan, Queen Latifah, Carly Simon, her DVD, and A.R. Rahman's tours. He is a prolific composer in the field of film, television, and commercial music. He has written music for Paramount, Disney, and MGM's television shows including Cheers, Family Ties, Star Trek, and Fame. He wrote the Touchstone TV logo, which is still used today. As a studio musician, he has worked for luminaries such as Thomas Newman, Jave Grusin, Alan Silvestri, and Carmine Coppola. Today, he is part of Thomas Newman's core team creating drum and synth programming, for instance, for James Bond's Spectre and Skyfall, He Called Me Malala, Get On Up, the James Brown biopic, Exotic Marigold Hotel, Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and many more. He was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Music Direction for Jazz at the White House. He received a Grammy Award nomination for Best Jazz Instrumental Album for his 2009 album Positudely on Resonance Records. In addition to releasing numerous albums as a leader, Beasley has released 2 albums with his 15-piece big band Monkestra. Both albums, Monkestra Volume 1 and Volume 2, were nominated for Best Large Jazz Ensemble at the Grammys, and Ask Me Now nominated for Best Arrangement, Instrumental, or A Cappella. Hey, John, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Let's just dive in and begin with perhaps working with Freddie Hubbard. I mean, you worked 8 years, right, with Freddie?
Yeah, about 8 or 9 years. It was I guess you could say that was my college education.
How did you end up getting that gig?
I had a couple friends that were playing with him already. Ralph Penland, great drummer, and Bob Shepard. And Billy Childs had been doing the gig for quite a while before me, and he decided to lead the gig. And so Freddie had been kind of going through a few piano players. And so I got recommended, and I ended up staying for a while. My first gig was in San Francisco. There was no auditions; you just did a gig, So my first gig was in San Francisco.
Now, you mentioned in an interview that just working with him in Jazz Inside, they asked you what kind of conversations you had with him, and you mentioned something about comping, and he would say, "Don't lead me, don't lead me." And could you just go a little bit more in depth into that?
Yeah, actually, Miles would say the same thing. They would say, "Don't feed me." In other words, don't lead me in a chord. Don't follow me, don't lead me. So if you're playing a blues, don't start voice leading for them. Let them do the voice leading. In other words, also don't start playing heavy or fiery until they start playing fiery. When they're going to want to lead the arc of the solo. So. Meaning, if they're not ready to peak yet, don't push them to peak. So that could be harmonically, rhythmically, passionately, passionately. It could be a few things.
When it came to single line improvisation, did you ask him for any guidance in that department?
The things I learned mostly from Freddie were not so much single line stuff like that, but learning how to accompany a solo, what my role in the rhythm section was, and being ready for anything in a way. He would call tunes that I would not know, but I would still have to play them. He didn't ask; he just started playing them, and so I would have to use my intuition in my ears and hope that the bass player knew it, so that I could hear at least the fundamentals, right? So stuff like that, being ready for anything, playing fast. He would start to set off with Bird-like, usually, blazing, really super fast. You're not warmed up, and after a while, we'd ask him, why do you start out so fast like that? And he would say, well, because after you play that fast, the rest of the set is downhill, and he's right. He's right. You play that fast, the next tune, you're all loose.
Now, how fast are we talking, like beats per minute?
Fast.
Fantastic. Now you mentioned like listening and really trying to listen to what he was doing and listening to the rest of the band. Now I just want to go a little bit earlier than that with regard to your development. Do you have perfect pitch when you were, I mean, you come from a musical family, so growing up was using your ears a very important part of your development?
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I also learned how to read music too, so the combination of the two is what really helps your growth as a musician.
So did you have perfect pitch?
I don't I don't believe I do. I have relative pitch, and sometimes I could pick pitches out of thin air or whatever. You know, I haven't really like, you know, done a formal ear training or anything like that. But, you know, my dad would like play games with us and play pitches on the piano and ask us to, you know, to name what it is, that kind of stuff, you know. But I don't think I have perfect pitch, but I have relative pitch.
You mentioned in your teens you were just playing endlessly along with records and that kind of thing. So those early influences, what were the albums that were really shaping your style at that beginning?
Let's see. There was a record called Generation, the Dexter Gordon record with Freddie Hubbard and Cedar Walton, Billy Higgins, and I think Buster Williams. I used to play along to that. I used to play along to Walking in Space, Quincy Jones record, all the Fat Jones Mel Lewis records, Afro Blue, Maiden Voyage a little bit.
Would you like slow down records and try and take things off the record like that back in the day?
Yeah, sometimes. I didn't really ever, you know, I could count on one hand how many solos I actually wrote out and transcribed. You know, yeah, I was not a big transcriber. But I would learn them, you know, and be able to sing them, you know, but not necessarily write them down.
Talk about singing. How important is that for a developing player? How important is singing then when it comes to developing the play, even if you're not a singer?
I think singing is great because it really helps with your phrasing, you know, especially for, you know, a non-wind instrument player or brass like piano, guitar, bass, vibes, you know, and that. You know, it really teaches you the art of phrasing, you know. Also, you know, learning lyrics of a song is great to have that sort of that story to play to, you know, in a song. You know, it's almost like scoring a film, you know, or that inspiration is great, the lyrics. In fact, it's also great for songwriting, you know. I mean, I took one semester of formal singing one time, and I noticed that it really helped my playing a lot, you know, and especially my songwriting, you know.
You mentioned that you started writing jazz arrangements in junior high school. So composition and arranging and writing, how did that start for you?
Well, my dad is a composer, you know, and taught arranging, improv, and at North Texas State University back then, So, you know, I was always watching him write at the piano growing up and writing. And then sort of my bridge records into jazz were, you know, bands like Earth, Wind & Fire, Blood, Sweat and Tears. They were sort of horn bands, right? And then I grew up in Denton, Texas, where they had 11 lab bands, you know, University of North Texas. So there was, you know, all this big band influence, and of course, you know, you had to have an arranger to have a big band. So then my dad brought home Central Park North, this Thad Jones Mel Lewis record, and it totally freaked me out. And you know, then Walking in Space is Quincy Jones record, and so, you know, I really wanted to be an arranger. I wanted to be Quincy Jones before I even really wanted to be a serious piano player, you know. Yeah, those records were great for me. And, you know, I think wanting to be an arranger and thinking like an arranger helps me as a pianist too, as far as setting palettes and coloring and structure.
Since you mentioned your father was a professor of music, did you get the opportunity to look at many scores as a young man developing?
Yeah, sure. He had scores that he was working on. By the time I came around, he was writing mostly contemporary classical music. So yeah, he taught me how to set up a score and start with the 4-line sketch score and then blow it up. He taught me everything. I wouldn't be here without my dad. He taught me everything I would ever need to know.
So he played contemporary classical music. So it's fair to say that would be an influence on you as well, right? So did you listen to a bunch of classical music growing up too?
Yeah, he was always playing Elliott Carter and Takemitsu, and of course, he loved Beethoven as well. But he also played Art Blakey and Jimmy Smith and Charlie Parker at home. So I had kind of a wide palette.
Did you play classical piano pieces growing up?
Yeah. I taught. I took lessons from a lady down the street, in my neighborhood, who was the wife of one of the faculty members that my dad taught with. So yeah, I had formal, and then my mom was a junior high and high school band director, so I played in her bands and played oboe all the way through school, and so yeah, I had a fair amount of classical training. Not so much on piano, mostly on oboe.
Now let's move a little bit ahead, and so I love the whole Freddie Hubbard because he's such an amazing player. And could you mention a couple of anecdotes just from that 8-year tenure that you had with him? What are some fond memories you had, performances that you've had in that band?
Well, Freddie was sort of a throwback to really kind of a generation before him. He was a bebopper in a lot of ways, the way he lived his lifestyle and what have you, and his life on the road. He kind of taught me to be resilient and tough, and to stand up for my music, or maybe that's not the best way to put it, but to be confident, because he came from those days where if you couldn't play, you get made fun of, or you get thrown off the stage, or he came from that era of jam sessions where if you you came up with your horn, or you wanted to sit in, they'd count off Cherokee in some weird key, and you'd have to deal. So sometimes when I'd be playing solos, he'd come over, stand right behind me, and look right down at my hands while I was playing, right? So he kind of, at that age, as a young guy, he kind of toughened me up, and taught me that you had to play under maybe not so great conditions, So by the time Miles Davis called me, I was ready for Miles. I knew that I could not be intimidated. I guess Freddie kind of taught me, or gave me the strength not to be intimidated. Which is, sometimes you're playing on gigs and Chick Corea might walk in, or I remember playing gigs and Theodore Walton in the audience.
What's the difference between playing with a Freddie Hubbard and playing with a Miles Davis?
Oh, well, by the time I got to Miles was playing he was playing kind of a different style of music. He's playing it was more of a show, it was a set show every night. When you were going to solo, you kind of knew what was happening. You had specific parts to play, Well, Freddie, he could call any tune anytime. It was more of a jazz gig. So it's sort of different,
Now, I have one of my best friends, Christopher Jangalewski, is an enormous fan of Vinnie Colaiuta, and you played in Audio Mind with Vinnie and Steve Taviglione, Gary Willis, and you mentioned in one interview that you really enjoyed it because you improvised entire sets of music with that band. Talk a little bit about Audio Mind and how special that experience was.
Well, I had known Vinnie since I was about 18 or 19 years old. We kind of came up to LA together. We did a lot of recording sessions together, a lot of records, and at that time there was a lot of recording work in LA, and so we needed an outlet, to play, and there was this club called what was the name of that club? Le Cafe. This would have been, I think, late 80s, early 90s. Oh, no, it was late 80s, right? So, this was sort of the beginning of sort of smooth jazz, or, sort of this LA sound. And we were rebelling against that because we wanted to play more like, Weather Report and Miles and, more stretchy music, right? So we formed this band called Audio Mind, and this is in the days where, like I played mostly all synth, and Thelonious was playing Iwi and saxophones and Willis, and we decided that we would just sort of be the anti-LA band and improvise sets, and we had a ball, and people started coming out and appreciating it.
And so talk about the improvising the entire sets. How did that work, like technically speaking? Like, how did you guys talk to each other on the bandstand or before the show started?
Well, when you improvise sets, you don't really talk. You're like, I would start a motif or, a color, and Willis would come in, or Garrett, or what was it? Vinnie might, come in with another idea. We go with him. Sometimes we break it down to duos. And if we wanted to change tempo, we'd just change tempo. I don't know. That's very hard to explain how to improvise.
Now, did you guys talk beforehand, before going on stage? Like, okay, this is it. This is this key or that kind of thing. Or was it just all unspoken?
It was all unspoken, yeah. I mean, sometimes we would play, like a blues framework, 12-bar format, but then it would always end up somewhere else, because at that time Vinnie was very much into rhythmic modulations. So we'd modulate the rhythm, end up in another tempo, and Thelonious and Willis have amazing ears, right? And so if I wanted to modulate, I just modulate, and they go right with me, or they play some other mode on top of it, which would be, set off another journey, and another inspiration point, and you just kind of go from there. And I think people liked the idea that we were doing that, just to see if we would fail, maybe sometimes, or like it's like watching a high wire act, an acrobat.
Now, let me ask you a broad question here. So, what is the John Beasley piano style? If you could really try and put it into words.
I don't know if it's just piano. I think it's just the way I hear music, and I would say for my music in general, it's maybe the element of surprise. People, maybe I'm brave enough to go for something, and it ends up being a surprise for people. Now, my piano style, I would say it's rhythmic. I was so influenced by Herbie Hancock that sometimes I had to stop listening to him because, I end up, because I love him so much, I end up sounding a little bit like him. But, I love rhythm. I like deconstructing things. I like contemporary harmony. So that's sort of what my piano style, I think, is based on. I have a love of the blues that I think hopefully comes through my playing and my phrasing. That doesn't necessarily I'm playing blues scale. It just means that I love the feeling of the blues. Yeah, a little dose of Thelonious Monk in there, I'd say.
Now let's jump over to Sergio Mendes. And everybody knows him from his worldwide massive hit Más que Nada. But you could give a better sense of the man beyond just that song. Describe your relationship with him and working with him on the tours.
Well, that was my first sort of real international touring gig that I'd ever had. This was in the early days of when people started using two keyboard players or what have you. Synthesizers were being more used live. So he wanted somebody that could play the orchestral parts, play synth parts, and a little percussion. So I auditioned with him, and came by and played for him and all that kind of stuff. And then,
could you describe that audition? How did he respond to your playing?
Well, that was a long time ago. I think I just played piano for him. I got recommended by his percussionist, and so I think I went to his house, and he brought me to his studio, and I played a little piano for him, and that was it. So of course he asked me if I knew anything about synthesizers, and of course I did. I told him what synthesizers I had and all that. So a couple of weeks later, he called me, and we went to the music store and picked out a synthesizer. It was great. He picked out a Jupiter. No, it was a Jupiter 8, which was an early Roland polyphonic analog synthesizer. But the thing about Sergio is that he was getting back into more, I guess, during the 70s, he was kind of doing a lot of more sort of commercial funk records in a way, disco records and stuff like that. And by this time, he had recorded this record called Alegria in Brazil with composers like Ivan Lins and Jovan, Edu Lobo, Gilberto Gil. All these guys had sung and wrote a tune on this record, and Oscar Cassaneves orchestrated it. So it was a beautiful Brazilian record, all done with Brazilian musicians.
John, how familiar were you with Latin music at the time?
So he was in Brazil. He had done this record. So all these Brazilian musicians. So he came back to the States and put a band together to play this music. And I didn't really know who a lot of these guys were. I know who Jobim was, of course. So he gives me this cassette of, Gilberto Gil and like the guys I had mentioned. But he also had a cassette of Ivan Lins playing all his beautiful tunes on a piano in Sergio's living room in Rio. It was awesome. Tunes like The Island and Love Dance and all this stuff. And he gave me this good, and he said, John, I want to learn these tunes. I want you to transcribe them, and especially Ivan's voices, because I really love the way he voices. So I came back, and I went away and took the tape with me, and did the work. A couple months later, I came back, and he actually said he was going to pay me to do it. So I came back, handed him the music, and he said to me, "Oh, John, thank you, man. This is for you." So I can't read music.
Oh, wow.
So it was sort of a backward way of him telling me he wanted me to learn this music, and it was sort of my introduction to Brazilian music and harmony, So back to your question, I was playing in an Afro-Cuban band. It was the first time I'd been really exposed to that. So that's how I met the percussionist who recommended me. So I was learning montunos and playing with Justo Amario in this band. So I was learning a little bit, but then, of course, in Sergio's band, it had Chao Neto, who was, his original bass player and was Jobim's bass player, and, Claudio Sloan and Oscar Cassaneves, and, his wife, Gracinha, was singing. So I just got totally immersed in Brazilian music, and to this day, I still listen and learn a lot.
Can you mention a favorite anecdote from the tour?
So a lot of tours. We went to Israel for about 2 weeks, and that was pretty amazing. Playing in, these Roman amphitheaters, and, remember that. But basically, I remember like having little jam sessions with these guys, and being on tabletops and stuff at restaurants, learning rhythms, and that kind of thing.
Now let's talk about Steely Dan, which would strike fear into a lot of musicians. But not only that, you were the music director for the Steely Dan, which is on a higher order. So, and you mentioned that working with Walter Becker and Donald Fagen was special. Can I ask you a question? Is it true that they would require like 40 takes for a single track in the studio?
I don't know if they were keeping track of numbers, but they were infamous for really beating a song to death and then resurrecting it. That was their thing. And usually, sometimes they would go back to the demo or one of the first couple takes. But their process was that they kept going and beating it down until it was pulverized, and then most of the time ended up going kind of right back to one of those fresh tracks. But that everybody has their process. And also they like to hear other musicians. They like to try other flavor musicians, on it. So that's why you have a lot of different musicians on those records playing on different tracks, overdubbing. They all didn't necessarily play together, but.
What's it like working with Becker and Fagen? Like, describe your work with the band and your relationship with those artists.
Well, for me, it starts with Walter Becker, because I was asked, right before I got the gig with Miles, I was asked to play on a record he was producing called Flying Cowboys with Ricky Lee Jones. So I was working in the studio with him when I got the call to go with Miles, and I was torn because I really wanted to make this record with these guys, right? But they said, "Oh no, man, you got to go. So they kind of pushed me out the door. So about a year later, Walter. This is before they had gotten back together. This is when Walter sort of started poking his head out again and getting back into music. He was starting to produce records. So he had an imprint on Windham Hill Jazz, a production deal. So he offered me a record deal and produced my first 2 records. So that's really how I got to know Walter, and how he was in the studio, and how he liked to work, how he liked to mix. All of this was really very cool. The way he would choose tunes and help me with sort of direction with arrangements and tempos and, all kinds of things. And then he hired me to work on his solo record, which is called, I think, 13 Tracks of Whack or 11 Tracks of Whack, something like that. And so, yeah, he was living in Maui, and so I would come out and spend a month at a time, off and on for about a year, working on his record. So during this time, he and Walter got back together and started thinking about putting their band together, started touring, right? So they did that. They started out with another pianist, which I was heartbroken over. But anyway, I got over it. And then eventually they asked me to join the band around 94, I think, 95. So I spent, good 4 to 5 years touring with those guys and recording a little bit. And, yeah. They didn't really need too much of a musical director, though, because they know what they want already. But I helped put the bands together, rehearse the bands, do sound checks, that kind of stuff. But they were very much in control of their own music.
Let's move on to something a little bit different now. You worked on American Idol, and not only that, a music director position when it was at its height, because this is with Carrie Underwood and the major stars. This is like when American Idol was like pretty much in the popular lexicon. Now, could you describe, how did you get that work?
I grew up playing here in L.A. with this guy named Ricky Minor, bass player and musical director, and he ended up being Whitney Houston's musical director all those years when Whitney was, at her peak, and he ended up with this gig. So and I'd worked with him on other projects, Spice Girls and other TV shows and stuff. So Ricky called. He knows kind of what I can do, so he called me to help him out with this show. So I was in charge of at the beginning of each season, I guess there were 25 contestants, something like that. So we would listen. We'd help them pick tunes, do the key, find a key for them. And then the hard part, or the most interesting part to me, was, it had to be like about a minute and 15 seconds. So how do you edit, a very familiar song
to get the core of it?
To get the core of it and the gist of it, and also the spot that shows off that particular contestant's vocal ability, So we'd sit around with that, and we had to do the whole thing in one day because it was live TV, and so on Thursday or Friday you're picking these songs out, and then we arrange all weekend, and the contestants have all weekend to learn them, and Monday we rehearse and camera block, and then Tuesday we're live. So it was cool. It was like working in the heyday of live TV back in the 50s or something.
How many seasons were you on American Idol?
I did every season, but I think 3 or 4. So 11 years, 12 years, something like that.
Amazing. So you're doing like 25 songs on the weekend, and just how much work is that, really, to put that into perspective?
But there was a team of arrangers. We had a stable of arrangers, because there's no way one guy could orchestrate all that for the band by Monday morning, or actually Sunday night, because they have to get to the copyists first.
Any particular standout performance that you're really proud of on that show?
I think for me, it's when you're able to see the growth of a particular contestant, whether they won or got to the final 3 or not. How they were able to deal with the early days of social media and a lot of hate mail, and learning how to, a lot of them had never even sang with a live band before, with real musicians, so it was really great to see the growth and maturity and some of the joy that these young people would embrace,
Now let's switch over to film composing and TV and commercial music. Now, you've written for all these major companies. Let's start with, what was it like writing for Cheers, one of the biggest TV shows of all time?
Well, that's sort of wow, that's an old story. Sorry about that. That's funny. Let's see. Well, I was very young when I was doing Cheers and those shows. I was in my early 20s, and I was playing in a band with a TV composer. This guy wrote music for like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley and Paramount shows like that, and he started using me on his sessions. So I met the people, like the engineers and the secretary at Paramount Studios, the secretary in the music office. And so they needed, in the early days of synthesizers, they needed a synthesizer theme of Star Trek. So, so they hired me to do that, and in those days, there weren't really any home studios. This is, I guess, early 80s and mid 80s. And so they booked the studio up there at Paramount, and I became friends with the engineer who was quite a bit older than me. He was in his 60s, and he sort of mentored me and started recommending me to other composers.
What was his name?
His name was Dan Wallen, and he worked on My Fair Lady and had designed, MGM and Paramount Studios. He was a very, very accomplished guy, mentored me, and so he recommended me to the head of music at Paramount TV Music, this guy Jack Hunsaker, to sub for some of these composers. So I started subbing and doing underscore for some of these sitcoms and sound alikes. They back in those days, you needed a song to sound like Wham. You go in with real musicians and record it, so they could play it over the radio or in a scene or whatever.
So you're no stranger to big TV shows then?
I was very young, so I was 21, 22 years old. So I was so good. The part of the thing about being a jazz musician is that it really prepares you for anything musically in a lot of ways, and also to learn how to fake it, right? So I didn't know how to write for TV music, but I knew I always wanted to because I was a Quincy Jones fan, and I wanted to be like Quincy Jones. So I just faked it at first until I learned how to do it. So anyway, this guy Craig Fruin, who had written the Cheers for a while, took a few years off, and so I stepped in and wrote music for Cheers.
Now, you've also worked with Thomas Newman quite a bit. Could you talk about working with him on the James Bond series?
Yeah, well, I've worked with Tom for 30 years, just about every movie he's done. So the thing that's great about Tom is he's an improviser, and he's a very creative guy and very open-minded composer. He's not the kind of guy that's going to bring a score and just say play this and only this. He really values our input and our improvisation skills.
Is he a jazz guy? Does he have a jazz background in a way?
No, he doesn't. But contemporary music. So Philip Glass, all this stuff. But he's still an improviser. He just doesn't know bebop changes, but he's an improviser. So that's sort of what we do. He'll say, I need some kind of propulsion here. I need some help with this scene. I need this. I need that. It's and we'll go in and sort of put our own vibe onto it. And the James Bond movies, I mostly did synth programming and drum programming, and most of all the drums you hear on there is me. And
can I ask you a technical question, John? Can I ask you, what's your setup, so to speak, with the programming? What programs do you use?
I use Ableton Live, Pro Tools. I use Contact as a sampler, Omnisphere 2. Yeah, Chaos pads, all kinds of effects. That's mostly my go-to stuff.
30 years, incredible. And some of the biggest grossing movies of all time, like Finding Nemo, WALL-E. Could you talk about working on those particular ones, the animated ones?
Yeah, those movies were done in 3 segments, because back then rendering the cartoon would take months. So we'd do the first third of the movie, take a couple months off, and then do every 3 months we'd be in the studio doing. So those were year-long projects. Every movie has a different style of music in a way. With Nemo, of course, it's all underwater. There's the drama it's sort of like Bambi underwater, right? So the drama is, here's a little kid that's lost, very brave little kid, and so you kind of put yourself into that situation and use your imagination. So the sounds, of course, had to be something evoked, being underwater, but also suspense, but not in a too scary way, because it's a kid's movie. WALL-E, a whole nother environment. You're in space. So lots of room for music, those huge expansive, shots of nothingness, of infinity, right? So how do you evoke that with sound? And of course, in WALL-E, there was lots of sound effects, the sound of WALL-E himself, the sound of the ship, sound of all the gadgets in the ship. So you had to kind of write around that. You had to kind of stay away from glitchy type sounds. So every movie has its own story and its own life, its own musical character, and that's what's great about doing those things.
Let's switch gears now to talk about your Emmy Award nomination for the music direction for Jazz at the White House.
Well, those Jazz at the White House was actually an International Jazz Day show that was actually presented at the White House. So for the past 7 years, it started with Herbie Hancock. Herbie Hancock is a ambassador, UNESCO ambassador of the arts, I believe is his title. So his mission was to get a jazz day, like celebration of jazz every year, like Earth Day, which is UNESCO sponsored, and Women's Day. There's probably other ones as well I'm not thinking of, but so Jazz Day is every April 30th forever, right, through UNESCO. And so we put on these concerts, usually all over the world. Like we've done it in Paris, Istanbul, Cuba, the White House. We were just in St. Petersburg, Russia, Osaka. And so we kind of bring this message of unity, musical unity, and showing how all these different cultures, can get along through music, right? Right. That's the message of Jazz Day. So this is something Obama wanted his last year in office. So we were able to bring all these incredible artists to the White House and perform the show, and it was televised on ABC. So my job was to figure out what everybody was going to play, and different different personnel, whatever, and trying to mix personnel up so that it's maybe a little different for them, having a Lebanese pianist play with a Afro-Cuban band or what have you. In Cuba, I had a beautiful Korean singer sing Besame Mucho in Spanish, right? So this is kind of what we do. And we did one for the White House, and that was on ABC TV, and it got nominated for an Emmy.
Okay, now let's talk about that awesome album that you released in 2009, Positutely, which was Grammy-nominated for Best Jazz Instrumental Album. Talk about that album a little bit.
That record, I'm a Louisiana native, and I was writing that music when Katrina happened. So New Orleans was sort of on the mend, and that whole area. So I wanted to sort of evoke the Louisiana musical vibe, but also a sense of healing. But so that's sort of the story behind that record. I was living in New York at the time, and walking down streets there and singing music in my head, and playing with different guys there in New York, and recorded it in New York, and that's what was the impetus behind that record. Great musicians: Jeff Tain Watts, James Genius, Benny Maupin, Brian Lynch, and myself. What a groove that was, man! To dream up a band and a record like that,
Of course, we can't get away from talking about your fantastic 15-piece big band, the Monkestra, which has been nominated for both albums for Best Large Jazz Ensemble. We've watched some great interviews where you talked about the orchestra in other places, but maybe you could talk about two specific tracks, the tracks that were nominated for Best Arrangement, Instrumental or a cappella at the Grammys, Ugly Beauty, Panonica, and Ask Me Now. Could you talk about those two tracks?
Yeah, Ask Me Now was sort of one of the first arrangements that I did of Monk's music for a big band. The song is very nostalgic sounding, already. It has this but also I wanted to that song actually started with the intro, the whole vibe of that. I really wanted to kind of like write some kind of monk like ostinato, if you will, to set up the song. And I was messing around with it. And I had it on piano for a while, and then I got the idea that maybe I should try it with two bass clarinets. So once that happened, it sort of set the table for the whole arrangement. Gregoire Marais played beautifully on it. The harmonica player, he played great. So it has this very nostalgic, warm feeling, that arrangement. And so that kind of was the second one I did. It kind of started me on my whole journey of this Monk big band, this Monkestra project. Ugly Beauty and Pannonica. I was in New York. I was in New York for a week and writing in a hotel room. Right. So there's something about Monk's intro. He plays this arpeggio that's very evocative, and so I kind of took that and put a sort of Afro-Brazilian beat to it, and sort of has this funky kind of vibe to it. So, I kind of dug into my Brazilian bag and evoked, crickets and birds and bugs and sort of this ugly beautiness, swampy kind of thing. But yet the melody is very haunting, so it almost sounds like, so with the trombone, it really works. And then I don't know how it happened. I was at the piano one day working on it, and then I got the idea, instead of going to bridge, I could go into Pannonica here and change meter. And somehow or other it worked. I didn't even have to change key. And it sort of made a natural modulation, life is full of these accidents or these things. You have to let them happen. If the door's closed all the time, these inspirations aren't going to walk in. So I always try to keep the door open and try things, and that one seemed to work.
Do you always write at the piano, John?
No, I actually write more by singing into my iPhone and getting form and tempo and groove down that way, and then figure it out at the piano and at the computer.
This might be a little bit off the wall, but when do you find you're the most productive when it comes to writing? Is there a particular time of day or a location?
That's a good question. I think, when I have a lot of writing to do, your body starts and your mind starts knowing that it's time to do it, and you build this sort of you build this muscle, right, to where you're doing it a lot. There are stories. I love the story about this author in New York who goes to. He's a very famous author, and he didn't write at home. He had an office. So every morning he'd put on his coat and tie and walk to the office and write from like 9 to 1 every day. And his body and his mind knew that was his time to write. So it would start flowing after a while. And he never really missed a day unless he went on vacation or something. And usually he was done by the afternoon, So so I started, I kind of like doing that. It's impossible for me to do that these days because my schedule is so crazy. But when I do have time, I love getting to it in the morning and practicing in the morning and writing in the morning and getting into a flow that way.
Yeah. What's your practice routine? And is it typically in the morning?
Well, nowadays it's typically anytime I can. Airplanes, hotels, evening, whenever I can, But
what is in the practice routine now? What actually are you working on, John? Like, what are things that you are interested in and things that you want to develop and practice?
Well, right now I'm working on music for upcoming tour stuff. I have a trio gig this Wednesday, so I'm learning music, some of my old music, relearning it, But I do practice my scales with the metronome and with the drum machine with clave. I try to play a little Bach every day. Keep the fingers moving.
If I could be specific, which Bach is it from the Well-Tempered Clavier?
Yeah, that's what it has been lately. It's particularly the last one in B minor. It's amazing. It actually changes keys so many times. It's a brilliant piece of music. It's also Bach is so good for the fingers and the chops. To play it slow or really work on it. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. I leave I have a gig with Diane Reeves on Friday, so I'm going to practice some of her music. Then I go to Vienna this weekend, for a few days because the Vienna Radio Orchestra is premiering one of my sort of classical pieces, one of my symphonic works. So, I'm going to go to rehearsals and check out the gig. And then I fly from there to New Zealand to play the weekend after that at the Wellington Jazz Festival with Monkestra. And then I'm back for a couple of days, and I have a couple of gigs in China. So I'm learning some new material, and then I go to Europe in July with Monkestra. So I've got to kind of reacquaint myself. So that's lately I've been practicing on music I need to prepare for myself.
So to end off, I'd like to ask you to give some advice on just a few quick topics. So best piece of advice you can give for somebody for arranging. What's the best piece of advice you can give?
I would say to really pay attention to the music that you hear in your head and your heart, and find a way to get that out, and not be swayed by what you think is right or wrong, just what you hear. And then figure it out and make it theoretically sound later. But get the sound out and the form and the arrangement out that you hear in your head, and put that down first.
And you've had such a broad, wide career of all sorts of amazing performances and recordings and things. What's the best piece of advice you can give, just a career in music in general? What's the best career advice you could give for music?
Take every gig, and you'll learn something from it, and you'll meet people from it that will help you get other gigs, and you'll end up with gigs and you can recommend them. And, don't be, for me, it doesn't work to be sort of stylistically snobbish, right? If you're going to do a country and western, if somebody calls you for a country and western record, then you'll probably get something out of it. Like I used to play country records, and I'd just play the blues or play gospel. So there's value to all music, and you learn from every gig. And all those gigs, all those non-jazz gigs I did, definitely helped my jazz playing. And the other way around, I wouldn't be able to have done those, R&B gigs and studio sessions without having a jazz background, because that prepared me, learning how to read music and improvise, have chops, and listen to all kinds of different jazz.
Bonus question, top 3 classical composers.
Oh, that's really hard.
That's a hard one, yeah.
Well, Bach, Alban Berg.
Any piece by Berg that you really like?
I don't really know the names of them, man. I'm not good at the names. I would say Berg, and my third one is, I can't think of his name right now. He's a great Russian piano
Rachmaninoff?
composer.
Scriabin?
No, Scriabin. Yeah, Scriabin.
Right. Wow. Listen, everybody, John Beasley, one of the greats. We've been so lucky to have him on the show. John, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. The great John Beasley, everyone. Thank you, John.
My pleasure. You had really good questions, and thank you for your listeners and to supporting your show. That's great.
I hope you enjoyed the interview, because we had a lot of fun doing the research and everything.
Likewise, man. Thank you very much, and I hope to meet in person one of these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care, John.